The Death of Dracula. The first known Dracula film is a lost Austrian movie from 1921, The Death of Dracula. This film's Dracula is an inmate at an insane asylum who claims to be the Count, but when he gets shot with an ordinary revolver, he flops over dead, leaving behind a journal entitled Diary of My Immortal Life and Adventures. This reminds me of Bubba Hotep with Elvis, JFK, and the Lone Ranger all doing battle with a redneck mummy. And the movie never tells you with 100% certainty that any of the protagonists are who they claim to be. It's interesting that the very first Dracula movie was already playing with postmodern themes of identity and pop culture. Before we had Dracula on screen, we had a guy who read Dracula and said, "He's literally me." Nosferatu. This movie holds up. I think we can safely call it the first canon Dracula and the first great horror movie. It sets the basic plot structure that would become more or less the standard going forward. Bram Stoker's original novel kinda sucks. It's too long and it's a bit dry, and Nosferatu condensed it into a digestible 3-act structure with Harker's arrival in Transylvania, the journey west, and the final confrontation. This is the first time Dracula ever burned to ash in the sunlight. In the Bram Stoker novel, it merely weakened him. Dracula. The iconic Bela Lugosi Dracula film was based on the stage play, also starring Lugosi. A lot of what defines this version of the story is rooted in the demands of live theater. The high collar frames Dracula's face for better visibility, for instance, and the action is framed like a detective story, emphasizing dialogue over the action and set pieces of Nosferatu. This is the movie that really defined the main cast of a Dracula story, with the Count, Van Helsing, Harker, Renfield, and Mina. Renfield and Van Helsing are barely there in Nosferatu. This one holds up too, and is probably the first time Dracula was envisioned as more of a serial killer than a conventional monster.
Children of the night, what music they make.
Dracula, Spanish language version. It's the same movie shot on the same sets, but in Spanish. There's a handful of differences throughout, but we're not stopping to smell the flowers here. Son of Dracula. Universal's first official sequel was Dracula's Daughter in 1936, but Dracula doesn't appear on screen in that one. Son of Dracula rounds out the Universal trilogy, but takes place in a new timeline with Lon Chaney Jr. as the Count, traveling to New Orleans under the alias of Alucard. Pretty sure this is the movie that coined that name. Chaney makes for an imposing Count, opening the character up for a broader range of interpretations than simply impersonating Lugosi. And there's some really beautiful shots, like this one of Dracula floating across a swamp. I think this is the first time we ever see Dracula with a mustache. The director of this one went on to make some noir classics like The Killers, and there's a hint of that in Son of Dracula, lending it a unique feel among the Universal films. The House of Frankenstein. 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was the first Universal Monsters team-up movie, but this was the first to feature the big three, Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman. And it's the first time we've seen Dracula reanimated from a pile of bones with a stake through the chest. This was John Carradine's first shot at the role, with Lon Chaney Jr. playing the Wolfman. This was one of the most expensive Universal Monster movies to date, and it shows. It looks fantastic. It doesn't save the gothic imagery for the finale. You get thunderstorms and carriages and foggy back roads and Frankenstein labs from beginning to end. A lot of early Dracula movies are very talky. This one is fast-paced, action-packed, and loaded with interesting characters. But Dracula dies before the Wolfman is even brought into the film, and the Wolfman dies before Frankenstein is brought back to life, so it's pretty disappointing if you wanted a monster fight. The House of Dracula. House of Dracula brings Chaney and Carradine back as the Wolfman and Dracula, both visiting a renowned doctor in hopes of finding a cure for their monsterism. You know, it'd be easy to read these films as transgender allegories. Body dysmorphia themes feature pretty heavily in this one and House of Frankenstein. Almost every character is envious of someone else's body. House of Dracula is more of a slow burn than House of Frankenstein. It spends more time letting its characters breathe. John Carradine is able to flesh out a more sympathetic take on the Count, no doubt jealous of the humanity his co-star Lon Chaney Jr. brought to Lawrence Talbot in the previous film. But then he dies halfway through the film again after succumbing to his baser instincts, and the Wolfman is cured before Frankenstein is brought back to life. Another disappointment if you wanted a three-way team-up with these characters. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. It holds up as a comedy, it holds up as a horror movie, and you actually get to see the big three monsters sharing screen time. If you ask me, Young Frankenstein is the best Frankenstein movie, and this is the best Universal Monster team-up film. Not only do you get Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and Dracula duking it out in the finale, there's a brief cameo for Vincent Price as the Invisible Man.
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man.
Lugosi returns to the role of Dracula for the first and only time, having played Dracula-inspired but not quite Dracula characters in films like Mark of the Vampire. The film, being a comedy, frees it up to have these exaggerated effects shots like this animated bat transformation, and it's full of beautiful gothic imagery. If you're only going to watch one of the Universal movies, watch this one. Dracula in Istanbul. Dracula in Istanbul isn't based directly on the Stoker novel or on any previous movies, but on Impaler Volvode, a novel that is sort of a translation of the original book, but taking a number of creative liberties. Among them, linking Dracula directly to Vlad Tepes, making this the first movie to treat Dracula and Vlad as the same character. This is also the first time we see the baby feeding scene on screen, and the first time we see him scaling the walls like a billy goat. I like the movie's spooky atmosphere, but other than some historical firsts, there's not much here that other movies don't do better. Dracula looks like a school principal in this one. Dracula. Probably the most significant new development in Dracula movies in the 1950s was the addition of red blood in the Hammer version of Dracula. Christopher Lee was the right man for this visceral take on the character. No longer brooding in the shadows, hiding behind his cape, Lee's Dracula is a towering menace, drooling blood and throwing his victims around, and Peter Cushing gives a similarly physical performance as Van Helsing. Something I like about the movie is how it strips everything down and works it into a lean 80-something minutes. The gruesome finale is one of my favorite death scenes in any Dracula film. If you think of older horror movies as being fairly bloodless and tame, this one is gnarly enough to satisfy slasher fans. The Return of Dracula. Releasing the same year as the first Christopher Lee film, The Return of Dracula already feels old-fashioned, and it starts off like a serviceable but unremarkable B-movie. But once it settles in, it's maybe the quirkiest Dracula movie ever produced up to this point. Thanks mostly to Francis Lederer, the first Jewish actor to play the Count, depicting him as more of an eccentric relative than a menacing foreigner, hiding out with a typical suburban family under the alias of Cousin Bellick. Note to self, insert Roman Bellick joke here. The best scenes are between Dracula and his kayfabe cousin Rachel, who is enchanted by his background in high culture and art.
Cousin Bellick, have we offended you?
Offend?
Well, I thought at first we were going to be such good friends.
Aren't we? And the surprise for your acceptance, for me to conform, to be as you would want me to be?
Well, I didn't mean that at all.
I think this movie is kind of a hidden gem. They could have done more with the premise, and I think the story is better suited to a light comedy film, but Lederer alone makes it worth a watch. Night Gallery, The Devil Is Not Mocked. I'm generally not going to be cover TV shows on this list because how could I possibly track down every single time Dracula appeared in like a Family Guy cutaway or a Roseanne Halloween special or something. But The Devil Is Not Mocked, a B story from Rod Serling's anthology horror series Night Gallery, is worth mentioning as it gives Francis Lederer a second go at playing the Count. Probably inspired by Lederer's heritage and Christopher Lee's background as a real-life Nazi hunter, The Devil Is Not Mocked sees Count Dracula fighting the Nazis in World War II as the leader of the Balkan resistance. Throughout, he hosts this Nazi commander, absorbing his insults as he mocks his barbaric, outdated way of life.
You have no homeland. You are a doorstep to the Ukraine. You become a mat on which we wipe our boots before re-entering the fatherland.
As soon as the clock strikes midnight, you hear Dracula's creatures of the night devouring the men posted outside as the Count finally sinks his teeth into the commander's neck.
You must forgive my service and our primitive Transylvanian customs.
And then he shows off the medal he got for serving his country. I like to think of this as the canonical prequel to Return of Dracula, and it confirms Leder as my favorite Dracula on the list so far. Andy Warhol's Batman Dracula, another lost film and probably more of an experimental art piece than an actual narrative film about Batman meeting Dracula. Billy the Kid versus Dracula. The copyright on Dracula expired in 1962, so after that point you go from one Dracula movie every few years to a pretty steady stream of them, being produced by whoever felt like making one. There's no quality control from here on out, so if you're like a Mystery Science Theater fan and you watch stuff like this to see the reviewers suffer through horrible, awful films, this is the sweet spot. And the part of the list I was dreading. This one was filmed in 4 days, and if you think about it, a vampire western is kind of a terrible idea. If you're shooting at night, you can't show the beautiful frontier scenery, and if you're shooting in the day, you can't show Dracula. John Carradine gets another crack at the character after being shortchanged in his earlier Dracula film, so you could call that the one upside, except Carradine calls this movie the one regret of his entire career. Dracula kidnaps Billy's girlfriend and takes her to a silver mine. And that does not play into the finale at all. The obvious thing to do is Billy the Kid finds that his bullets have no effect on Dracula, but then discovers that silver bullets will do the trick, right? But no, he bonks the Count on the head with his gun and then stakes him. This is the first public domain era Dracula movie on the list, and it's probably the worst Dracula movie ever made. It's not bad in a funny way. This isn't Troll 2. This isn't The Room. It's barely coherent. You spend most of the movie waiting for something to happen, and when it does, it's filmed in pitch black. If there's one good thing you can say about the movie, it's not morally reprehensible in any way. I forgot about the racist Indian scene. So yeah, it's racist too. Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Christopher Lee's second go at the Count. This movie is a lot of people walking around the castle. Dracula finally shows up nearly an hour in after his butler stabs a dude and mixes his blood with the Count's ashes to revive him. Christopher Lee doesn't have any dialogue in this movie at all, and Lee says that that's because the script was dreadful and he refused to speak his lines. The writer says otherwise, but of course he would, right? I side with Lee because would you write a part for Christopher Lee and not give him any dialogue? There's some neat visuals here and there, but the movie is slow moving, it lacks a compelling hero like Peter Cushing's Van Helsing, and Dracula's barely in it. The ending where the Count sinks into the ice is pretty cool, but this may be the least necessary of the Christopher Lee Draculas. Mad Monster Party. You know Rankin Bass, the studio that did all the claymation Christmas specials? They made a monster movie with character designs by Jack Davis and scriptwriting contributions from Harvey Kurtzman. The movie plays like a 90-minute string of Crypt Keeper jokes with these charming little stop-motion characters on diorama-like sets. This version of Dracula was a clear inspiration for the Count on Sesame Street and basically set the template for funny Draculas going forth. If you ever went, Vla, you're basically doing this guy. The story concerns Baron Frankenstein retiring, with all the monsters fighting to see who will inherit his secret destructive formula. The plot never really gets in the way of the fun, though. It's just sight gags and one-liners from beginning to end.
You'll discover who was the original Batman.
I like how Dracula and the Wolfman are depicted as old buddies with a history of raising hell together. This is the perfect movie to put on as background noise at a Halloween party or something. I'm pretty sure it's the only time we've ever seen the Universal monsters fighting King Kong. Blood of Dracula's Castle. John Carradine is in this one as Dracula's butler. I swear his career in Dracula movies is cursed. Supposedly Jane Mansfield was going to star in this movie before her untimely death. She dodged a bullet. The only reason this movie ranks above Billy the Kid versus Dracula is the beautiful Southern California scenery, really setting the mood for a gothic horror adventure. Alex Darcy may be the worst Dracula I've seen, but a lot of that is down to the script, with Dracula tied to a chair begging for his life at the end. Dracula has risen from the grave. It's another Christopher Lee one. Las Vampiras. I've never seen one of these luchador films before, but I guess you could compare them to superhero films, but there is a key difference in that the public is not privy to a luchador's secret identity. In real life, I mean. So Mil Mascaras never takes his mask off in Las Vampiras, and you see him in these simple dialogue scenes and going about his everyday life in full costume. You can get into a whole thing here about masks and identity, to what extent these fictional characters are real. Mil Mascaras is a real guy. Vlad Tepes was a real guy. But you pull on that thread and you realize everything is fiction. Anyway, John Carradine is back, held in a cage by these female vampires as he's been emasculated by a splinter in the brain. So the female vampires are looking for athletic men to serve as slaves and mates. The movie is kind of slow moving with lots of filler. It's mostly Mil Mascaris and his colleagues discovering clues and debating what to do next. But John Carradine gets to show some real fire for the first time, arguing with his captors about the fate of their race. Assignment Terror. Shit Sandwich. Jonathan. Jonathan envisions in 1800s Germany where vampires immune to sunlight have taken over under the rule of a patriarch known only as the Count. I don't want to pad this list out with a bunch of almost Dracula characters, but they name Bram Stoker in the writing credits and lift some scenes directly from the book, recontextualizing them in this vampire dystopia, so I'm calling this guy a Dracula. We had a Jewish anti-Nazi Dracula in Francis Lederer. Now we've got a Dracula with that cunty little Hitler hairdo. The movie uses vampires to examine dynamics of power and oppression, how desperation, fear, and greed make people complicit in acts of tyranny. The movie's depiction of vampires is cold, sober, and unromantic, envisioning them as thugs and bullies. A recurring motif is these wide panorama shots of vampire cruelty. The film is uniquely unsympathetic to its vampires, and when the villagers storm the castle and push their oppressors into the sea at the end to drown them, chanting, "Die, die," it's just a wonderfully cathartic and morally uncomplicated finale. The movie's utter contempt for fascists is a beautiful thing. But there's a scene where a rat gets stomped to death, and it doesn't look like they faked it. That's the kind of thing that just sours a whole film for me. Taste the Blood of Dracula, another Christopher Lee one. Scars of Dracula, another Christopher Lee one. Count Dracula, another Christopher Lee. Actually, Count Dracula is notable for a few reasons. It's actually a Spanish film and Christopher Lee's first time starring as the Count outside of a Hammer movie. It's the most faithful adaptation to the novel, including almost every key scene and character. It's Christopher Lee's favorite. It features Klaus Kinski, who would go on to play Nosferatu. And finally, it served as the basis for the experimental film Quadasuk Vampire. The movie itself is a bit dull, feeling a bit like a mechanical recreation of the book without much identity of its own. Quadasuk Vampire. It's a bunch of behind-the-scenes B-roll from Count Dracula, shot in high-contrast black and white. A highly regarded experimental film with some interesting music and cool shots. This is the first time we've seen Dracula wearing sunglasses, but I'm not going to pretend I found this movie to be anything but a snooze fest. Dracula vs. Frankenstein. I was too hard on Billy the Kid. That movie was merely a piece of shit. This one has Lon Chaney in his final role when he was at the lowest depths of his alcoholism and praying for death. It actually started as a biker movie and then they added the monster subplot in post. This is the worst movie I've ever seen in my life. Actually, the lighting is so bad that seeing feels generous. This is the worst movie I've ever had playing on a screen in front of me. Blackula. Like Jonathan, Blackula finds nothing romantic or sympathetic in Dracula. The movie opens with Mamuwalde, an African prince, asking the Count for help in combating the slave trade. Dracula refuses, openly lusts after Mamuwalde's wife, Luva, and insists that actually it's a compliment for a man of his station to be attracted to a black person.
It is a compliment for a man of my station to look with desire on one of your color.
Dracula here is sharply lampooned as an example of Eurocentric classism and racism. He bites the African prince and buries his wife alive with him. Awakening 200 years later in the 1970s, Blackula meets Tina, sort of a stand-in for Mina, believing her to be a reincarnation of Luva. This is the first time reincarnation is brought into the story, 20 years before Francis Ford Coppola got around to it, and that's not something that occurs in the book. This leads to the surprisingly beautiful and grotesque ending where Tina is killed and Blackula willingly walks into the morning sun. In terms of how it serves the character arc of a tragic anti-hero, I think this is a stronger finish than Coppola's. Sad Hood movie. Dracula AD 1972. Releasing the same year as Blackula and following a similar premise, Dracula AD 1972 starts off with the Count being killed with a wagon wheel back in 1872, and then I started this list telling myself I wouldn't skip any of these movies, but this is the most obnoxious song I've ever heard in my life. Dracula finally shows up about 37 minutes into the movie, and then we don't see him again until the third act when Peter Cushing kills him in a scene that could have been pulled from any other Hammer movie. Dracula AD 1972 doesn't deliver on the promise of its premise. We don't see Dracula doing coke in a nightclub or wearing platform shoes or joining the Black Panthers or anything. Far from the worst movie on the list, but certainly the most disappointing. Count Dracula's Great Love fucking sucks. The Satanic Rites of Dracula. The Hammer Draculas all follow the same continuity, so Satanic Rites, the last one in the series with Christopher Lee, takes place after AD 1972, and it's kind of a spy thriller meets satanic cult movie. So it's a lot of ugly British guys looking at slides, and then a bunch of people in robes reciting incantations. If Quadasuk Vampire didn't put you to sleep, this one will. There's some nice titties in the first act, but 20 minutes in, you're tired of looking at them. The movie springs to life with some exciting chases and shootouts here and there, only to go back to another 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time of dreary exposition. I've heard so many good things about the Hammer movies, but I've generally found them to be pretty dull with hardly enough Dracula in them. The first one was bold, exciting, and innovative. You can hardly believe it was released in 1958. The last one is stuffy, outdated, and slow. You can hardly believe it was released in 1973. I imagine Christopher Lee was happy to finally put these movies behind him. God knows I am. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Jack Palance is one of my favorite actors for his colorful, larger-than-life villains. What I really like about him is he never settled into a single villain persona like some bad guy actors do. His turn as Dracula is surprisingly understated, rarely showing more than a frustrated grimace or a silent scowl. On the rare occasion that he speaks, his dialogue is spoken barely above a whisper, and he prays with the calm indifference of a practiced hunter.
I pray you be seated and eat. Excuse me that I do not join you, but I have dined already.
Even when he grabs someone by the throat, he tosses them aside with a flick of the wrist. Palance's performance takes on a strangeness in its subtlety. The script by Richard Matheson of Shaft and Unforgiven is solid, adapting the broad strokes of the novel into a feature film structure. This is a TV movie, so it's generally kind of plain looking, without any big exciting set pieces, but there are some nice shots here and there. While this ranks as an upper mid-tier Dracula film overall, Palance delivers what is easily a top 5 performance, and not wanting to spoil that, he turned down several offers to return to the character later on. The reincarnation angle is brought in once more, this time with Lucy looking exactly like Dracula's wife. So we still haven't actually seen Mina as Dracula's reincarnated wife yet, but we're circling it. Blood for Dracula, also known as Andy Warhol's Dracula. Right away we've got another first with Dracula painting his hair black under the opening credits. And this kind of sets the movie off on a strange note as he looks into the mirror applying his hair color, then pulls the chair away and we're reminded that he has no reflection. He's been sitting here going through a human ritual that serves him no purpose. Dracula has fallen ill because he can't find any virgin blood in Romania, so his servant insists he move to Italy, where the regressive Catholic Church has ensured more virgins per capita than anywhere else in Europe. Udo Kier plays Dracula as a bit of a fuss budget. His aversion to crosses and sunlights is depicted as more of a sensitivity than a matter of life and death, and the Count is frail and helpless, dependent entirely on his hired help. Dracula and his manservant have trouble assimilating to Italian society. The worker at the house that is hosting them, for instance, is openly hostile to snobbish high society types, an attitude that would probably be punishable by, I don't know, a whipping or something back in Romania.
Are you our servant for our stay or not?
I'm no one's servant. I'm a worker here.
Oh, excuse me, please. I misunderstood. My vocabulary is not large. I thought worker and servant are the same.
Just don't make that mistake again.
But socialism has never really been a dirty word in Italy. Predictably, Dracula soon discovers that there aren't as many virgins in Italy as he'd been led to believe, because this handsome young socialist is slinging dick all over the place, tainting the blood of the women vying for the Count's attention in hopes of becoming pampered noblewomen.
The blood of these whores is killing me.
This one fits into the same niche as Blackula and Jonathan, regarding Dracula as a parasite on the neck of the less privileged. but it shows its count as an object of pity where those films have only contempt for the character. An object of pity that needs to be eradicated, but still.
He lives off other people, he's no good to anybody, and he never was.
This is an overlooked classic that too often gets lost in the mix of trashy exploitation films of the era. Also, Andy Warhol had nothing to do with it. Legend of the Seven Vampires. Dracula showcases a new power in Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, the ability to transform into a Chinese man. This was a Hammer-Shaw Brothers co-production and the first Hammer film to cast someone besides Christopher Lee as the Count. John Forbes Robinson is credited as Count Dracula, but he spends most of the movie inhabiting the body of a Taoist monk played by Chan Shen, and he's actually voiced by the guy who did the dub, David DeKaiser. This movie never really clicks as a Kung Fu Dracula movie. It's more like a Kung Fu movie bookended by Dracula scenes. You can always count on Hammer to take a Dracula movie and mash it up with new genres in completely unsatisfying ways. Vampira. Vampira was briefly retitled Old Dracula to cash in on the release of Young Frankenstein, so if I decided to review every Frankenstein movie instead of every Dracula movie, I'd be watching Young Frankenstein right now. I'd probably be a bit kinder to this dreary, lifeless British comedy if it hadn't asked me to compare it to one of the funniest movies ever made. David Niven is onto something with his light-hearted portrayal of a middle-aged Dracula, but the experience of watching this movie is like sitting in a lukewarm bath because you're too tired to get up and dry off.
I think you'll find a very interesting centerfold this month, sir.
Yes? Oh, you're right. They are magnificent. Did you ever see prettier veins?
Yes, indeed, sir.
Son of Dracula. When Dracula, played by Dan Meaden in Nosferatu-style makeup, is killed, his son, songwriter Harry Nilsson as Count Down, get it, is called on to take over as king of the Netherworld, but he would rather be human and makes a deal with Van Helsing to cure him of his vampirism. The movie was produced by Ringo Starr, who plays the Dracula family consigliere, Merlin the Wizard. The movie is notable for its rock and roll soundtrack, for being the first on-screen appearance of Dracula's son, and for being a piece of shit. The movie was filmed in 1972, shelved for 3 years, failed to find a distributor, and has since been seen only at midnight movie screenings and on bootleg copies. The movie's failings come down to its amateurishness more than anything. It's not cynical or ugly, it wasn't thrown together over a weekend like Billy the Kid. It's not tedious, and it doesn't exploit any elderly, alcoholic Hollywood legends like Frankenstein vs. Dracula. It definitely sucks, but it's a hard movie to dislike. During the musical sequences, you almost catch a glimpse of what this movie must have looked like in Ringo's head, especially during the climactic transformation scene set to Harry Nilsson's cover of Badfinger's Without You. It doesn't achieve the heartbreaking effect they were going for, but you can see what they were going for. And I like the idea of associating Without You with Dracula. Lady Dracula, another one of those not really a Dracula movies. He appears briefly in a prologue establishing the backstory of the Lady Dracula, creeping on these little girls before getting hunted down and slaughtered for being a pederast. The movie isn't streaming anywhere online, so I can't give this one a full review, but the opening scene is the only part that's relevant to the list anyway, so whatever. Stephen Boyd is effective as a creepy, kitty-diddling Dracula, but the lighting and makeup do all the heavy lifting here. Dracula and Son. Christopher Lee's final turn as Dracula was in the French comedy Dracula and Son. They spend the first 20 minutes explaining how Dracula got a woman pregnant, which is, he had sex with her. And there's no real jokes in the movie until his son, Ferdinand, is born. The humor mostly comes from the fact that Ferdinand doesn't really take after his old man, unable to even frighten a little old lady when he takes him out to learn the family trade. Supposedly the French version is a little funnier, but the French aren't funny, so I highly doubt that. The movie never rises above a light chuckle, but there's a sense of melancholy to the film that I found surprisingly effective. Dracula winds up starring in vampire movies while Ferdinand struggles to find his place in the world, and there's an underlining theme that even in Immortal worries about what he's leaving behind. That's another first, by the way, a vampire playing a vampire on the silver screen. Dracula and Ferdinand eventually fall in love with the same woman, an actress who looks just like Ferdinand's mother, leading to lukewarm, slightly funny hijinks. It may sound like I'm being ungenerous to this movie, but it really isn't very funny. It is, however, a charming, bittersweet send-off for the Count, and an introspective contemplation of Christopher Lee's place in horror history after setting a still unbroken record, having played him in 11 feature films. You know, it makes perfect sense. If your dad was ageless, you'd be competing with him for pussy all the damn time. The movie is sort of aimless, meandering, and maybe 20 minutes too long, but unlike most of the comedies on this list, it's rarely tedious, owing to a charismatic lead performance by Bernard Menez and plenty of screen time for Christopher Lee's Dracula. Dracula's dog. If you want to make a movie about Dracula's dog, it should be a cute little dog, right? A rat terrier would be perfect with Dracula's association with rats.
Hello, vampire dog?
Casting a big scary Doberman is a little too on the nose. Anyway, Dracula's barely in this movie, and neither is the dog. The best part is in the beginning when the dog pulls the stake out of a vampire's chest to bring him back to life. The movie ends with all the vampire dogs getting killed, so fuck this movie. Nocturna. In order to pay outstanding property taxes, the Dracula family convert their castle into a high-end hotel. The movie was co-produced by its star, Puerto Rican belly dancer Nye Bonet, who's not the greatest actress in the world, but she's charming and very beautiful, and the movie has a lot of nude scenes. And when she's not naked, she's wearing sheer nighties and low-cut dresses and stuff like that. There's also some fun disco music, and it took 40 years, but someone finally figured out what makes John Carradine a worthwhile Dracula. He was never as scary or as sexy as Christopher Lee. He wasn't as spooky as Lugosi or as sympathetic as Kinski, but if you wanted Dracula to pop in a set of fanged dentures and click his teeth together, there's no one better. He should have been the go-to funny Dracula, but for the most part, he was only ever cast because he was cheaper than Lee and Lugosi wasn't interested, and that's a darn shame. Like the other movies about Dracula's offspring, this one sees the kid falling in love with a human and turning their back on their vampire heritage. The late 70s would be when baby boomers were taking over the film industry, and it stands to reason those generation gap themes would run through this era of monster movies. Nocturna isn't an especially good movie, but it's charming, well-paced, and sometimes kind of funny.
In my prime of youth, I had magnificent hands. All the ladies would say, I was hung like a walrus.
Love at First Bite.
Brothers and sisters, when you is gone, you is gone. And ain't no way, no how, nobody's gonna bring you back here once you is dead.
Good evening. You know George Hamilton? He's that leathery-skinned, super tan guy. Anyway, he plays Dracula in this one. Reincarnation figures into this movie, with Dracula in the modern day spotting a magazine model he assumes to be a reincarnation of Mina Harker. The story is just an excuse to send Dracula and Renfield off to America for some fish-out-of-water jokes, like what Dracula AD 1972 should have been. He wakes up in a church, he gets taken to the pound while in his dog form, he beats up racist stereotypes.
Dudes like you just give the neighborhood a bad name.
This movie features the first Jewish Van Helsing in Dr. Jeffrey Rosenberg, a descendant of the original vampire hunter who changed his last name for professional reasons. I like this bit where they have a hypnosis off.
Sleepier and sleepier, Count. Drowsier and drowsier, Rosenberg.
Are you gentlemen
George Hamilton plays a very likable, charismatic Dracula, and I like that he gets a happy ending in this one.
Children of the night, shut up!
The Halloween that almost wasn't. From a Jewish Dracula to a Jewish Van Helsing to a Jewish Dracula? The Halloween that almost wasn't is a half-hour TV special, so I'm allowed to skip it, but it stars Judd Hirsch as the Count. I'm slogging through shit like Dracula's Great Love as an excuse to watch stuff like this. The special starts with a TV reporter relating a rumor that Halloween might be canceled this year. No real explanation on what the fuck that means, but he says it might be Dracula's fault. All the monsters convene at Dracula's castle to discuss what to do about this insane rumor that doesn't make sense. The Wolfman is doing a cowardly lion impression, Frankenstein is a surprisingly graceful dancer, and the rest of the monsters don't get any jokes. It turns out the Wicked Witch wants equal billing with Dracula or she won't fly over the moon on Halloween. Instead of meeting her demands, Dracula breaks into her house and tries to hypnotize her to force her to contribute her unpaid labor. That socialist in Blood for Dracula was onto something. The witch eventually decides to do her part for the sake of the children, but still insists that Dracula keep his promise to meet her demands, so it ends on a pro-labor message. This special is a charming waste of time, and Judd Hirsch seems to be having a lot of fun as the Count. I could definitely see someone having recorded this on VHS and making it part of their annual Halloween rituals. Nosferatu the Vampire, my favorite Dracula film, and my favorite Dracula. The word for Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire is haunting, a serious, eerie, tragic take on the legend. Something that sets this movie apart is the sense of Dracula as not merely a single hunter or predator, but as an envoy of a broader doom, bringing with him filth, disease, and widespread insanity, turning the whole town into a Dark Souls game. Mina and Lucy are combined into a single character, Lucy Harker, played by Isabella Adjani, who is probably the greatest horror actress that ever lived. Van Helsing's role in this film is minor, and Jonathan Harker spends the entire movie in a state of delirium after being bitten by Dracula, leaving Lucy Harker taking up the slack as the film's heroine, sacrificing her life to lure the Count into the morning sun. The movie ends with the vampiric Jonathan Harker riding off on horseback in a black cape, suggesting that the cycle of death and despair will start again elsewhere. Renfield and Dracula only share a single scene together, and I love this shot. Generally, we see Renfield as slave, underling, companion, but I think this is the only time he's been depicted as a barely tolerated simp, as if Dracula could do without these hangers-on, but he knows it comes with the job. I could go on and on about this movie, but then we'll never finish this list. What I'll say is, if you only watch one Dracula movie on my recommendation, watch this one. This is the first actual remake on the list, and it kind of closed the door on Dracula movies for most of the next decade, which means I have a whole new reason to love this film. No more of these shitty fucking vampire comedies. The next two movies were in production at the same time as Nosferatu. Then there's a couple movies where the Count features into an ensemble cast, an Italian movie, and really nothing else until Francis Ford Coppola takes a stab at the character. Dracula. Another first here. Frank Langella was the first actor to play both Dracula and Skeletor. Like the Lugosi film, this one was based on the stage adaptation and brings in the same lead actor. This one opens with the most impressive Demeter scene so far, a big, bold set piece, immediately differentiating it from the relative quiet of Nosferatu. In this version of the story, Mina Van Helsing discovers Dracula washed up on the shore. That's right, Mina Van Helsing. Langella's Dracula is surprisingly human, charismatic in the sense that regular people are charismatic, not like how vampires are charismatic. There's nothing about his interactions with the other characters to suggest that he's a monster in disguise, and we get the impression that he is not a vampire pretending to be a person, but a person cursed with vampirism. That he's not biding his time until he can feed. He genuinely enjoys making new friends and falling in love. So there's an underlying sadness to these interactions. Obviously they can't last because this dude is Dracula. The effect shots in this movie are frequently beautiful and dreamlike. Mina takes Lucy's place as Dracula's first victim and is eventually impaled by her own father. The movie ends with the gang killing Dracula and breaking his spell over Lucy, and she looks disappointed because now she has to fuck Steve Zahn from riding in cars with boys, but oh, Dracula's cape seems to fly off on its own, so maybe he'll be back. In many ways, this version of Dracula was simply too conventional in a year that had not only the greatest vampire film ever made, but also a very successful Dracula spoof in Love at First Bite. Dracula made its money back at the box office, but was considered something of an underperformer. It's a shame because this version introduces, or at least clarifies, some compelling ideas, like what if Dracula's victims actually want to be seduced? What if they prefer the adventure and danger of life with the Count to the dreary, limp dick loving of John Harker? And why can't Dracula be friendly and warm when he's not on the hunt? Wouldn't he fit in better if he wasn't always acting like a goddamn weirdo? A lot of what they do here, Coppola did it better, but there are some quirks specific to this rendition that later iterations never picked up on, and I think the movie deserves some acknowledgement. Dracula, Sovereign of the Damned, a feature-length anime based on the Marvel Comics version of the character. The movie condenses several years of Tomb of Dracula stories down to about an hour and a half, and the result is a whole bunch of fever dream nonsense that's difficult to explain. There are some very funny moments, like Dracula eating a hamburger in a fast food joint or begging for help after his powers have been stripped by the devil.
Open up, please! Save me from these vampires!
The movie looks really cool, so while I wouldn't recommend sitting down and watching it, I'll say that anyone out there making a Halloween-themed vaporwave playlist might want to mine it for clips. The legend goes that the Marvel version of Dracula was inspired by Jack Palance's portrayal of the character, but Tomb of Dracula actually predates Palance's Dracula. It was actually inspired by his take on Jekyll and Hyde. Frascia versus Dracula. I don't speak Italian, and I doubt this would be any funnier if I did. The Monster Squad. I've sat through enough of this shit to say with confidence that Monster Squad is the best monster team-up movie ever made. It's not so much an homage to Universal Monsters as it is a tribute to monster movie fans who kept the flame even when the studios didn't. Instead of boring scientists sitting around talking about chemistry, we've got basically the Goonies, and instead of the monsters being introduced and done away with one at a time, we've got them all working together right away. And instead of Frankenstein showing up at the very end to throw the mad scientist off the roof, he joins up with the good guys and fills the role of the movie's sloth. It's written by Shane Black, so it's exciting and funny with a hint of self-awareness that never gets too cutesy.
Come on, don't be chicken shit.
Analyzing it as a Dracula movie, Duncan Rieger does an excellent job depicting the Count as a heartless killer, and it's fun seeing a less nuanced take on the character. A teeth-gnashing horror baddie slaughtering cops with the flick of his wrist before being impaled by a face-turned Frankenstein. There weren't a lot of Dracula movies released between Nosferatu and Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992, leaving Monster Squad essentially uncontested in depicting the defining Dracula of the decade of Freddy and Jason. Vampire in Venice. A forgotten pseudo-sequel to Nosferatu the Vampire. Klaus Kinski's uncooperative behavior made the script unfilmable, so what you get is a confusing mess of scenes with a scattered narrative pieced together in post. There's nothing here that the first movie didn't do better, but it's fascinating that this film exists, like a movie you'd see in a dream, and there are some eerie shots throughout. I must have seen this once before because there are shots I remember from Nosferatu that aren't there, but they are here. Waxwork. The Monster Squad took place in a world where the Universal Monsters were both real figures and iconic movie characters. In Waxwork, the characters are all fictional, made real by their depiction in the wax sculpture displays at a museum. When characters cross the velvet rope into the displays, they enter like, you know in Grand Theft Auto how the interiors take you to a whole other map? I guess it's like that. A dimension where the scenes depicted in wax but actually dead bodies are 100% real. Bobby from Twin Peaks is the first to cross the threshold, assuming this to be an acid trip or holograms or something, ultimately deciding he must have been hypnotized.
Alright, I'm hypnotized.
His cynicism leaving him ill-prepared to manage the ensuing encounter with a wolf man, leaving the surviving monster hunter with no other choice but to execute him with a silver bullet. Count Dracula, played by Miles O'Keefe, is presented like a caricature of the bourgeois society to which Michelle Johnson's character, China Webster, aspires, treating her to an elegant dinner of raw meat in a bowl. In her misadventure across the velvet rope, she is eventually taken by the Count and turned into one of the undead. Dracula figures into this film very briefly, but I think this is an important depiction of the character, with China denying the existence of vampires even as she's looking right at them. As the only two American Dracula films produced in the 1980s, Waxwork and Monster Squad make fine companion pieces. In Monster Squad, the impressionable young characters are armed by their belief, where the yuppie college brats of Waxwork are made vulnerable by their disbelief. This movie has one of my favorite Dracula death scenes. Bram Stoker's Dracula, your girlfriend's favorite Dracula movie. The modern accepted canon really comes together in this film. For the first time, Mina is a reincarnation of Dracula's long-lost wife. Dracula is unambiguously depicted as being the same man as Vlad Tepes, and Van Helsing is a weird autistic guy.
Yeah, she was in great pain. Then we cut off her head and drove a stake through her heart and burned it, and then she found peace.
Doctor!
Dracula movies after Nosferatu the Vampire had to deal with a culture that saw monsters as hokey and laughable. Where Waxwork and Monster Squad embraced the subject of disbelief in the text itself, Bram Stoker's Dracula simply steamrolls your cynicism. The only fair criticism you can really make of this movie is that Keanu Reeves' accent is ridiculous.
He's the man himself. Yeah, look, he's growing young.
But let me tell you something I've learned as a ghostwriter. When you have a really fussy, nitpicky editor, including a few deliberate typos will give them something to whine about, instead of more subjective or abstract things like comma placement, sentence structure, and tone. Professional haters will make the exact same number of complaints, no matter how many flaws actually exist in a piece.
Music. Those animals.
I'm not suggesting that Coppola employed Keanu's goofy accent on purpose, but I think that in a year dominated by dreary, small-stakes personal dramas and self-serious sex thrillers, the accent functioned as a lightning rod for the audience's cynicism, disarming the most dismissive and disinterested critics with a glaring shortcoming we could all agree on, so that we didn't have to listen to a bunch of belly aching about how the movie is so over the top, and they didn't dress like that in turn-of-the-century London, and the plot is kind of incoherent and blah blah blah. We don't have any way of looking at an alternate timeline where Keanu Reeves was replaced with, say, Joseph Fiennes or something, but I would bet that in that timeline, the movie had to go through a long cycle of dismissal, mockery, ironic midnight showings, and underappreciation before finally achieving cult status decades later when the Gen Z YouTube cinephiles finally got their hands on it. There's not a lot to be said of this film that hasn't been said, so I'll just add to the chorus. It's a masterpiece, a celebration of filmmaking itself with its incredible practical effects and breathtaking production design. Gary Oldman's presence in the film is grand, without missing the smaller moments, and Anthony Hopkins is my favorite Van Helsing. Dracula Rising. Roger Corman has been in the movie business since the early 1950s, and it's kind of surprising it took so long for him to get around to making a Dracula movie. This one was made to ride the Coppola film's wave of publicity. Coppola was actually a Corman protege, by the way, Corman having produced his directorial debut, Dementia 13. The Dracula in this one is adequately played by Christopher Atkins, and he's the son of Vlad the Impaler. This is your usual reincarnation love story, but presented in this deliberately slow, artsy sort of way. With Corman, you're guaranteed a serviceable film, but you're not always guaranteed an especially good one. Dracula Rising is in that C+ range. It knows its limitations and doesn't outreach its grasp, or outgrasp its reach, whichever one. UFO the movie. There's a British comedy movie entitled UFO released in 1993 that lists Dracula as a character, but all I can find of this film is a 10-second clip of a butchy dominatrix in tight PVC bondage gear. 5 stars. The Monster Mash. Based on the Boris Pickett novelty song and the stage production I'm Sorry the Bridge is Out, You'll Have to Spend the Night, The Monster Mash is a cheaply made, obnoxious musical that I can't believe was released in theaters.
I've got those old infinity, immortality, all eternity blues.
John Kassir, the Crypt Keeper, plays Igor, so that's fun, but mostly the movie is a less funny, less inventive version of Mad Monster Party. Dracula is played by Anthony Crivello, who you may know from Nothing in Particular. The Count kinda gets lost in the mix of boring characters and bland jokes, and sorry if I'm being overly dismissive of this film. It's far from the most tedious Dracula comedy, but all that singing. I wish theater people knew how much the rest of us don't like them. The movie centers on a plan to bring Elvis back to life with the blood of young virgins, and when I say centers on, the movie is really so scattered and unfocused, it's not really centered on anything. It's just an excuse for a bunch of singing, dancing, drama class kids to make me mad. Nadja. A lo-fi, chill-hop Dracula movie to study/relax to 24/7. Nadja concerns the fallout for Dracula's dysfunctional family when the Count is finally killed by Van Helsing, played by Peter Fonda, who is the highlight of the movie.
He was like Elvis in the end. Drugs, confused, surrounded by zombies.
Dracula's daughter, Nadja, is played by the gymnast from Seinfeld, and Van Helsing is accompanied by his nephew, that guy that looks a little bit like Paul Rudd. Other than Peter Fonda's street weirdo take on Van Helsing, my favorite thing about this movie is how it shifts from indie black and white to Universal Monsters black and white at the end as the action moves from New York City to Transylvania. Dracula's only in the movie in these abstract flashback shots, but every character in the movie is defined by their relationship to the Count, so I'm counting it. As far as art house Dracula movies go, I like this one better than Quadasug Vampire. Dracula, Dead and Loving It. Maybe I'm being too generous to this film after all the horrible Dracula comedies I've been subjected to, but this is the funniest movie I've ever seen in my life. The movie goes over tropes and scenes and characters I've seen dozens of times by now, and it's a delight seeing Renfield nonchalantly spraying blood all over the place in his meeting with the Count, or Dracula's coffin sliding back and forth across the storage keep of the Demeter. Leslie Nielsen borrows bits and pieces from Lugosi, Christopher Lee, and Gary Oldman, but finds his own unique take on the character that I honestly think could inform future iterations of the Count. This Dracula is blunt and undiplomatic in his social interactions, and it stands to reason that if you could hypnotize people to do your bidding, you would never have learned how to charm them.
You will remember nothing of what I tell you.
Hello, can I help you, sir?
Can I help you, sir? What is the matter with you? Why did you not tell him?
I love Mel Brooks' take on Van Helsing, delighting in making his students faint at the sight of human organs in the early stages of decomposition. I love the dynamic he has with the Count, a pair of bickering old men wrapped up in their own private pissing match.
You are a man who likes to have the last word. I will not be drawn into such a childish exercise. Tolstoy.
It is immaterial to me who has the last word. Polotnik.
And then there's just good old-fashioned sight gags and slapstick.
Possess she whom you love the most, and there is not a single thing in the world you can do to stop me. Ow!
If you're making a comedy, the only reason to add to or subtract from or experiment with the cinematic language set forth by Mel Brooks is to adapt the basic principles to new toolkits. This is simply how it's done. The Creeps. The Creeps is another one of those movies like Waxwork where it's not the original Dracula, but a kind of living effigy of them. The movie sees a mad scientist type going around stealing rare manuscripts and using them to generate living, breathing monsters to do his bidding. These are the Wolfman, the Mummy, Frankenstein's monster, and Count Dracula. He has to sacrifice a virgin with his archetype inductor to produce his army of the night, but when she escapes, the monsters all come out at half height. They need to finish the sacrifice to complete the process and achieve full stature, setting the hunt in motion. Dracula is played by horror icon Phil Fondacaro, who lends the Count a kind of poetic soul.
How could I fail to recognize my brothers in darkness?
And as the most eloquent member of the squad, he generally takes control of whatever situation he finds himself in, intimidating the mad scientist and filling the room with his dark presence. What I really like about this Dracula is the hint of sympathy in his voice. Everything he says comes with an implied threat of death and dismemberment, but he phrases it as kindly as the threat will allow.
Did you back off or I'll break his neck?
Shame on you, young man. One oughtn't to speak so casually about breaking necks to those who have actually done it.
The height of this movie's monsters is certainly treated as a novelty, but never really as a joke. This is a Charles Band film, and this guy is one of the best cheapo exploitation auteurs. His movies are full of weird, quirky, memorable details. One of my favorites in The Creeps is Justin Lauer as private investigator David Raleigh, who conducts his business at his day job, working behind the counter of a video store, using company equipment to conduct his searches and holding meetings with his clients while checking customers out at the register. I like the boss lady at the library who literally gets off on old books too, designing labyrinthine bureaucracy for the specific purpose of keeping other people's grimy hands off her babies. The movie ends with the monsters siding against the mad scientist and willingly returning to the realm of fiction and fantasy where they can live forever in our collective imagination. I don't need to make a case about whether or not this is a good movie. It's an incredibly unique movie, and Fondacaro's Dracula is unlike any I've seen before. More than 50 movies into this list, I'm happier to discover a weird movie than I am to discover a good one.
But do not fear. We will always be with you in your nightmares.
Modern Vampires. Modern Vampires, or Revenant, starts out with Casper Van Diem using his vampire teeth to poke a hole in a cigar, and that pretty much says it all. It's a satirical vampire film like Nocturna, but it's also one of those post-Tarantino movies where no-budget directors were convinced that they were the new rock stars. Udo Kier is here, Rod Steiger plays Van Helsing, and the best thing about this movie is Craig Ferguson as an obnoxious art dealer vampire who takes a lot of glee in terrorizing his human victims. Dracula features in this movie as a nightclub boss who keeps the local vampires in check, making sure they don't go raising a stink and bringing the law down on the community. They call him the Count, but if the actual Van Helsing is here, I'm gonna say this is Dracula. You know on Intervention when it's a hot chick who's hooked on drugs and they show the greasy old man she's been dating? That's the vibe I get from the Count in this movie. I wouldn't call it a good movie, but it knows what it is and it's not as smug as a lot of post-Tarantino films are. Shadow of the Vampire. Technically speaking, Shadow of the Vampire is not a Dracula movie. It is a fictionalized account of the making of the original Nosferatu, supposing that Max Schreck was an actual vampire performing in director F.W. Murnau's film in exchange for fresh victims. Defoe's vampire has the presence of a pet tiger, capable of being earnestly friendly, but always with a threat of mortal danger should he feel cornered, hungry, or startled. This is the most ghoul-like version of the character I've seen. He's not sexy pale, he almost appears to be rotting, and his behavior is frequently more animalistic than human. And there are moments in the film where he seems very human.
Who is this woman?
This is Ellen, my wife.
She has a beautiful bosom.
Requesting makeup, reminiscing on a time when he was pampered and revered, and taking full advantage of his status as a movie star to negotiate rewrites.
I don't think the ship is necessary.
What?
The ship.
His days as a human being are a distant memory, but there is still an echo of humanity and a need for socialization. This is the kind of premise that could easily descend into smarmy, self-congratulatory art house bullshit, but it's actually funny, frightening, and haunting. My favorite not quite a Dracula movie, The Wes Craven Trilogy. The Wes Craven Trilogy is the main Dracula series of the new metal cinema era, that stretch of time between The Matrix and Drive where it was all fast cuts, chrome and leather color palettes, hard rock scores, bullet time, and Omar Epps. The first in the series, Dracula 2000, casts Gerard Butler in the title role, and he's not a bad choice, but for the most part he's just stalking people and whispering to his vampire hoes. I think you could count all his lines of dialogue on both hands. I wouldn't mind seeing him take this part on again now that he's a little bit older and he could really sink his teeth into it. I think the Count always needs someone to bounce off of, a Renfield or a John Harker or a Mina or a Van Helsing, someone to argue with or court or boss around. And this Dracula's interactions with other characters are way too brief. Not to say this movie is no fun, it contributes some neat ideas to the canon, like Van Helsing staying alive by microdosing Dracula blood to ensure that he'll be around when he's needed to do battle with the forces of darkness. The movie's best idea is in Dracula's origin story, where he turns out to have been Judas, cursed to a life of eternal suffering for his betrayal of Christ. That's such a good backstory for a Dracula movie that it's surprising it took so long for someone to do it. I like the idea of Vlad the Impaler running his crusades in an effort to make it right with the man upstairs, and God's like,
"You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy."
Dracula 2, I think, is the weakest of the three. These dipshits revive Dracula and conduct experiments with his blood, and the Count spends most of the movie strapped to this rig. This movie introduced Jason Scott Lee as a Catholic vampire hunter tainted with a trace of vampire blood, and he's cool as heck, but the movie makes both him and Dracula inconsequential side characters in a story about a bunch of bozos I don't care about. So I was surprised when the third movie in the series turned out to be a bit of a gem. This one sees Jason Scott Lee partnering with one of the few survivors from the previous film to save another from Dracula's castle and to grant Dracula absolution and free his soul. Modern day Romania is in the midst of a civil war, and the film is sort of a road movie modeled after Apocalypse Now, with the Transylvanian imagery getting stronger and stronger the closer the heroes get to Dracula's lair, with Rutger Hauer doing a commendable job in the Marlon Brando role. Like Martin Sheen before him, Jason Scott Lee kills his target and completes his mission by embracing the darkness he was sent to eradicate, biting Dracula's throat and taking the Count's place as the king of vampires. I don't know that it's one of the best movies on this list, but it's a lot better than you expect from the second straight-to-DVD sequel to a box office failure. Van Helsing. I really like Stephen Sommers. He's probably best known for the Brendan Fraser Mummy movies, and he directed one of my favorite monster films, Deep Rising. I remember being pretty stoked for his Van Helsing film with Hugh Jackman, and when I actually watched it, it felt kind of lethargic and by the numbers with CGI that was dated even in 2004. Watching it again, I still feel the same. The goofy mid-2000s-ness of it has taken on a kind of hokey charm over the years, but the movie never finds the spark of joy that propels The Mummy. Richard Roxburgh is a serviceable Dracula, but this is like an MCU film before MCU films were a thing. The actors aren't so much acting a scene as they are posing on a green screen, so the effects team has something to work with.
Here we go. 10 years. Eyebrow acting.
Dracula 3000. First off, Dracula 3000 has nothing to do with Dracula 2000. This one is about Dracula in space, where every self-respecting horror icon has to wind up sooner or later. Captain Abraham Van Helsing leads a crew to salvage the abandoned ship Demeter in the Carpathian Galaxy, and yeah, you get it. The cast is packed with familiar faces, including Debo, Coolio, Udo, Casper Van Diem. And the cool thing is there's real personality and chemistry here. The banter feels authentic in that corny B-movie sort of way, and there's all this backstory and world building.
A metal plus sign. Okay, this dude was into mathematics.
In classic vampire movie fashion, the characters' distinctive personalities are emphasized to their most toxic extremes as they are turned, with Coolio being the first to go caca cuckoo, and kind of serving as the central antagonist for most of the film.
Aurora, baby, did I ever tell you how many times I see you and want to ejaculate all over your bazonkas?
This movie's Dracula is some chode in a Spirit Halloween costume, and you could say that they missed an opportunity to come up with like a Nosferatu-inspired race of space aliens or something, but seeing this goober running around the ship in his goofy-ass cape is a joy in itself. There are plenty of good and great Dracula films, plenty of horrible ones, but if you're looking for a fun, bad Dracula movie, this one's hard to beat.
I was a Proteus 3.2 PB.
PB.
Pleasure bot. You've only got a couple hours till the end of your world, and I'm off the clock.
Bingo, must be in the front row. Ain't gotta tell me twice. Come on, girl.
Blade Trinity. I covered this film and the next one in a comparison review before. Blade Trinity isn't as bad as its reputation would suggest, but it's not all that good either. The guy from those yogurt memes isn't terrible as a kind of warrior king vampire boss, but he never really clicks as Dracula. Though I like the Klingon sense of honor he shares with Blade, respecting his rival more than any of his allies, and I like his Devilman looking form at the end of the film. I hope the Blade reboot gives us a satisfactory version of the Marvel Comics Dracula, but I'm not holding my breath. Batman vs. Dracula. I love this movie. It's my favorite Dracula film of the last 20 years, and my favorite Batman film of the last 20 years. One of my favorite aspects of the movie is the mutual fascination between Batman and Dracula, each one intrigued by the other Bat guy. But the best part of the movie is Tom Kenny's Penguin, who fills out the Renfield role, bringing a kind of self-indulgent joy to his role of henchman.
You like? It's a plasma screen, you know, as in blood.
Dracula.
My Lord Henwood, this is all rather formal.
Yes, it is. I have a book of poetry in my pocket.
Please don't read a poem.
No. It is rather good, though. This bit. Thy love is better than high birth to me, richer than wealth, prouder than garments cost, of more
The Librarian, Curse of the Judas Chalice. It's directed by William Riker, and I guess it's part of an ongoing series of TV movies, like a cheapo Mummy or Indiana Jones. This movie is full of stuff that should be funny, but the wacky music and rhythmless pacing mute the jokes. Even Bob Newhart seems to misfire, and his delivery should be foolproof.
As far as my being 2,000 years old, that's just insulting.
Dracula doesn't show up until the very end of the movie, where it turns out he was this other historian who's barely in the film. This is less a Dracula movie than a movie with some Dracula in it at the very end. House of the Wolfman. I am not reviewing your student film just because you added it to a list on Wikipedia. This ain't Dracula, XXX. This one is confusing, and I wasn't sure if I should include it because the title says it's not Dracula. It also says it's not XXX, but everyone calls the main character Dracula, and the movie is full of explicit sex scenes. Maybe the title's supposed to be ironic. I feel this movie misses the mark. The eroticism of Dracula is all in the subtext. Look at how Udo Kier humps the floor while feeding, or the various rituals of courtship that so frequently preface the first attack. By making the sexual aspect so plain and literal, it's a bit like the Psycho remake where we hear Norman Bates jerking off while spying on his guests. If these characters were capable of normal sexuality, they wouldn't sublimate it into acts of violence. I will commend the film for achieving some decent atmosphere on what appears to have been a meager budget, but too often, story and character are sold short in the name of explicit sex scenes that honestly just go on a bit too long. Dario Argento's Dracula 3D. The bloody kill scenes in Tenebrae suggest that he'd be the perfect guy to make a Dracula movie. Too bad he's not. The movie starts with this shitty CGI fly-through of a Carpathian village under the opening credits, and you would guess it to have been made in 1998, not 2012. When the movie starts, it looks like a reenactment on the History Channel, filmed with flat lighting on a prosumer-grade camcorder with a high frame rate. This movie's count is serviceably played by Thomas Kretschmann, who played Van Helsing in a BBC miniseries. And this movie's Van Helsing, Rutger Hauer, who played Dracula in the Wes Craven trilogy, does what he always does in trash like this and brings a lot more weight to the job than it deserves. There are some moments that are almost effective, but these scenes are frequently undone by goofy computer animation meant to serve the movie's 3D gimmick. This movie sucks, and in a boring way more than a fun way. The Hotel Transylvania series. Adam Sandler is the most prolific living Dracula actor, having played the Count 3 times in the Hotel Transylvania films. You know what's missing from these movies is a sense of danger. When the little human kid wanders into the hotel and starts partying with the monsters, nobody there is even thinking about eating him, and Dracula explains that he doesn't actually drink blood.
So, Dracula doesn't drink blood?
No, I use a blood substitute, either near blood or blood beaters. You can't tell the difference.
I've just spent weeks of my life watching every Dracula movie ever, so it's not nostalgia goggles when I say this. Children's films are too safe and sanitized nowadays, to the point of being boring. Adam Sandler's Dracula is so toothless that he feels less like the Prince of Darkness than he does like someone's dad doing a vampire voice to be funny. This has been pretty much the only commercially successful take on Dracula this century, but it achieved that only by scrubbing him of his most essential characteristics. If you don't drink blood, you're not Dracula. Dracula Reborn. The fact that this movie is fairly well lit keeps it from being one of the absolute worst films on this list. Dracula Untold. They thought they could sweep this one under the rug, the actual first entry in the Dark Universe, a couple years before the disastrous release of the Tom Cruise Mummy reboot. This one is an origin story showing how Vlad Tepes became Count Dracula, with the Impaler meeting a vampire in a cave who turns out to be Caligula. One of the most interesting things about watching all these movies is seeing the various theories for where vampires come from and how Dracula became one, because none of that is explored in the novel. This movie has some cool stuff in it, like Vlad beating a whole army barehanded, but I think it makes too many concessions in its misguided attempt to launch an MCU out of public domain characters. Like, Vlad is too much of a nice guy. The man's last name was the Impaler. I don't want to hear how he actually did it for a good reason. A vicious, power-hungry Vlad could have been a lot more compelling, making for a movie with cult favorite potential instead of simply a failure to make Dracula the new Iron Man. Greg Turkington's Decker vs. Dracula. After watching half a dozen John Carradine Dracula films, I have to say that casting a confused old man in a cheap cape as the Count is a pretty good joke. Monster Family. This movie looks like it was made by asset-flipping Hotel Transylvania. The Invitation. How come in the movies, starving artists in the big city always have these enormous loft apartments with Fraser views of the New York skyline? Anyway, this one's about a young woman who discovers that her ancestry makes her a candidate to be Dracula's bride, and the movie explores the temptation surrounding that kind of thing. The fantasy of being a noble-blooded bourgeois parasite. There are some strong themes at play here, but it's all in service of a mediocre string of jump scares. Renfield. This is another movie I dedicated a whole video to. I found Renfield to be a 3-star comedy with a 5-star performance from Nicolas Cage, who plays Dracula as an overbearing narcissist, using guilt trips, gaslighting, and word salad to get what he wants from those around him.
You're the one who used me! You used my power because you're a husk! However, I'm the real victim here!
The Last Voyage of the Demeter. I've briefly touched on this one before. I like the idea of just taking one chapter of the Dracula story and making a whole film out of it. We pretty much only see the Count in bat mode in this movie, but you see hints of his humanity peeking through as he gives an evil grin while cornering his prey, taking delight in their torment. Renfield and Demeter were both underwhelming box office performers, and a pattern you may have noticed throughout this video is a tendency for a definitive Dracula film like the Francis Ford Coppola movie to be followed by several years of nobody really trying to top it. Then you get these ironic or subversive or satirical takes on the character trickling in, becoming more and more frequent to diminishing returns as the public loses interest, until someone comes out with another definitive take on the character and the cycle starts all over again. Well, if Renfield is this generation's love at first bite, then this generation's Nosferatu the vampire has to be...
I'm getting too much money!